"Cleaner, you missed a spot." The words landed lightly, but the laughter that followed filled the glass-walled boardroom like a sudden draft of cold air. Naomi Carter paused mid-step, her mop handle still warm in her palm, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the polished silence that had existed seconds before. She turned slowly, careful, composed, as 24 executives in tailored suits shifted in their leather chairs, some hiding smirks behind coffee cups, others glancing down at their tablets, as if embarrassed to be seen reacting. At the far end of the 40-foot conference table, Richard Holloway leaned back in his chair, silver cufflinks catching the afternoon sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago skyline, Lake Michigan stretching pale blue beyond the steel and glass towers. His expression wasn't angry, just amused, the quiet confidence of a man used to controlling every room he entered. Naomi nodded once, her movements small, deliberate, as she stepped forward to wipe the faint streak near the edge of the polished walnut table, the cloth gliding softly across the surface, leaving behind a flawless reflection of the ceiling lights above. The deal documents lay spread across the table like a carefully arranged battlefield, thick binders marked with color-coded tabs, legal pads filled with handwritten notes, and a single fountain pen resting near Richard's right hand, poised, ready. Naomi's eyes passed over the papers only briefly, but something in the layout caught her attention, a page slightly misaligned, a paragraph boxed in faint gray, the kind of formatting she remembered from years ago, from late nights at a community college library where she studied financial statements under flickering fluorescent lights while her mother worked double shifts at a nursing home. She lowered her gaze quickly, returning to her task, but the words lingered in her mind, quiet, persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. Around her, the executives resumed their conversation, voices low but energized, numbers floating across the room. 800 million, projected growth, acquisition leverage, each phrase layered with confidence and urgency. Richard leaned forward, fingertips touching, as one of the attorneys slid the final draft toward him, the paper whispering softly across the polished surface. The sunlight shifted, glinting off the glass walls, and Naomi moved to the far side of the room, guiding her mop across the marble floor, the soft rhythmic motion almost meditative, almost invisible. She had learned to move that way, quiet enough to disappear, steady enough not to interrupt. But as Richard lifted the pen, his wrist hovering above the signature line, Naomi's eyes flicked once more toward the open binder, and the faint crease formed between her brows, not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle tightening, as if something deep in her memory had finally aligned. The room grew still again, anticipation settling like dust in sunlight, and Richard exhaled slowly, ready to sign, while Naomi stood a few feet away, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle, her reflection faintly mirrored in the polished marble beneath her feet, the city skyline glowing beyond the glass, and the quiet weight of a decision, one that no one else in the room seemed to notice, hung silently in the air. Naomi Carter had learned long ago how to become invisible in rooms like this, how to move without drawing attention, how to let the rhythm of cleaning become a quiet language that no one questioned. But invisibility had never meant ignorance, and as she guided the mop across the cool marble floor, her eyes moved once more toward the binder resting open near the edge of the table, the bold header and faint gray paragraph still lingering in her thoughts like a half-remembered melody. And for a moment she felt the familiar pull of memory, late nights under fluorescent lights, numbers written across yellow legal pads, professors explaining risk allocation and liability clauses in classrooms that smelled faintly of chalk dust and burnt coffee. Before everything had changed, before hospital bills stacked on the kitchen counter and her mother's voice grew weaker with each passing month, before she traded textbooks for cleaning supplies and a student identification card for a temporary badge that read, Facilities Maintenance. The executives continued discussing projections, their voices calm, confident, certain, while the skyline outside shifted in the late afternoon light, long shadows stretching across the polished floor, and Naomi moved slowly along the perimeter of the room, careful not to interrupt, careful not to exist beyond the quiet presence they expected, yet the numbers being spoken sounded off to her, not wrong exactly, but incomplete, like a calculation missing its final variable, and when she glanced again toward the open page, she noticed the indentation of a clause, buried deep within legal language, the kind designed to blend into surrounding text, subtle enough that only someone trained to look for it would pause. And her grip tightened slightly on the mop handle, the faint rubber squeak against the marble echoing softly beneath the low hum of conversation. She remembered her mother's voice once telling her that contracts were not just words, they were decisions disguised as paragraphs. And sometimes the most dangerous ones looked the calmest. And Naomi inhaled slowly, grounding herself, reminding herself that she was not part of this meeting, that she was simply finishing her shift before moving on to the next floor. Yet as Richard Holloway adjusted the document in front of him, his pen resting lightly between his fingers, she felt a quiet tension building, not dramatic, not urgent, but steady, like the moment before a storm when the air grows heavy without warning. One of the attorneys leaned forward, pointing to the signature line, his tone reassuring, explaining that the acquisition would secure long-term control and eliminate competitive threats, and several executives nodded, their expressions relaxed, satisfied, while Naomi moved toward the far wall, wringing the mop into the bucket, the faint sound of water dripping echoing in the polished room, and as she straightened, her eyes caught the clause again, the phrasing precise, technical, but unmistakable to her, shifting operational liability under conditional restructuring, a phrase that seemed harmless on the surface, yet carried consequences far beyond the numbers being discussed. Naomi hesitated for half a second, her reflection faintly visible in the glass wall, the skyline stretching behind her, and she felt the weight of choice settle quietly in her chest, because speaking would mean stepping out of invisibility, and stepping out of invisibility had never come without cost. Yet as Richard lifted the pen once more, the quiet certainty inside her grew stronger, and the room seemed to narrow, the distant hum of traffic 30 floors below fading into silence, while Naomi stood still, hands resting lightly on the mop handle, her breathing steady, her expression calm, and the faint crease between her brows remained as she watched the pen hover just inches above the page. Richard Holloway did not notice the hesitation across the room, because his attention was fixed on the numbers in front of him, numbers that had defined his entire career, numbers that had built his reputation from a small venture capital office on the 32nd floor of an aging downtown building to the towering glass headquarters he now owned. And as he adjusted his cufflink with a slow, practiced motion, the room naturally followed his pace, the attorneys leaning in slightly, the executives sitting straighter, the quiet gravity of his presence shaping the air without effort, because Richard had always been the kind of leader who rarely raised his voice, yet commanded attention simply by existing. He studied the document once more, not because he doubted it, but because habit had taught him that the final moment always mattered, and outside the windows, the late afternoon sun reflected off Lake Michigan, sending soft bands of light across the conference table, illuminating the gold trim on the binder edges, the polished wood surface, and the faint reflection of his pen hovering above the signature line. Around him, the executives shifted subtly, a few exchanging quiet glances of anticipation, while the lead attorney, Michael Donovan, cleared his throat gently and nodded, his tone calm and reassuring as he explained that the restructuring terms would position Holloway Technologies ahead of competitors within 12 months, a projection backed by charts displayed on the wall screen, upward lines, clean percentages, and confident forecasts that felt almost inevitable. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, the slight narrowing of his eyes suggesting concentration rather than doubt, because he trusted his team, trusted the months of negotiation, trusted the data presented, and yet he had built his fortune on instinct as much as analysis. And for a brief second, he glanced toward the skyline beyond the glass. The distant movement of traffic along Lakeshore Drive barely visible from 38 floors above, a reminder of how far he had come from the cramped office where he once worked 12-hour days fueled by vending machine coffee and quiet ambition. The room remained still, the faint hum of the air conditioning blending with the distant murmur of the city, while Naomi Carter stood near the far wall, her presence unnoticed, her reflection faint in the glass, her hands resting calmly on the mop handle as she watched the pen hover, and Richard returned his gaze to the page, unaware that the quiet moment stretching across the room carried more weight than anyone realized. One of the executives leaned back, whispering to a colleague that this acquisition would define the decade, while another adjusted his tie, already imagining the press release scheduled for the following morning, and Michael Donovan gently slid the document a fraction closer to Richard, the subtle movement signaling readiness, confidence, closure. Richard exhaled slowly, the measured breath of a man accustomed to decisive moments, and lowered the pen slightly, the tip hovering just above the paper, while sunlight shifted again, casting a soft glow across the clause buried halfway down the page, words small, deliberate, nearly invisible within the dense legal language, and the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. The quiet tension settling into the polished surfaces, into the still air, into the silent reflection of Naomi. Carter standing a few feet away, her calm expression unchanged, her eyes steady, as the distance between the pen and the signature line narrowed by less than an inch. Naomi Carter spoke before she could second-guess herself, her voice calm and measured, soft enough that it did not echo yet clear enough to reach the center of the room. "Sir, you may want to review the liability clause on page 31. The words slipped gently into the silence, almost weightless, yet the effect was immediate, like a ripple across still water, and several heads turned at once, confusion flickering across expressions that had moments earlier been filled with certainty. Richard Holloway did not look up right away, his pen still hovering, but Michael Donovan frowned slightly, glancing toward the far wall as if trying to identify who had spoken, and when he saw Naomi standing quietly beside her mop bucket, his expression shifted from curiosity to mild disbelief. A faint murmur spread across the table, not loud, but unmistakable, a subtle exchange of glances, raised eyebrows, and restrained smiles that carried more dismissal than amusement. One executive leaned back in his chair, whispering something to the colleague beside him, while another adjusted his watch, clearly uncertain whether to treat the interruption as a misunderstanding or ignore it entirely. Naomi remained still, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle, her gaze steady but respectful, as though she had simply pointed out a misplaced object rather than interrupted a multi-million-dollar decision. Richard finally lifted his eyes, his expression calm, though a hint of surprise flickered across his features, and he studied Naomi for a brief moment, not with irritation, but with quiet curiosity, as if evaluating whether the interruption deserved acknowledgment. "The liability clause," Naomi repeated gently, her tone unchanged, "the conditional restructuring section." The room fell quieter again, not tense, but awkward, as if the rhythm of the meeting had been briefly misplaced. Michael Donovan let out a soft breath and offered a polite smile that did not reach his eyes, his voice controlled and professional. "Thank you, but everything has already been reviewed thoroughly." A few executives nodded subtly, the reassurance restoring their confidence, and someone at the far end of the table gave a small dismissive shrug. Naomi did not react, did not step back, did not raise her voice. She simply held her ground with quiet certainty, her expression calm as sunlight shifted across the glass wall behind her, reflecting faint patterns across the marble floor. Richard lowered his pen slightly, his gaze moving back to the document, then briefly toward the page Naomi had referenced, and for a moment his fingers paused, the silence returning in a softer form, as if the room itself was deciding whether to continue or reconsider. One of the executives chuckled quietly, not harsh, just lightly amused, and another whispered that the facility's staff must have overheard too many conversations. But Naomi remained still, her breathing steady, her presence composed, and the faint crease between her brows returned as she watched the document in front of Richard. The sunlight shifted once more, catching the small gray paragraph halfway down the page, and Richard's eyes followed the line almost instinctively, his pen now resting just above the paper, unmoving, while the quiet interruption lingered in the air, subtle yet undeniable, like a thought that refused to disappear. Michael Donovan adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his voice calm but firmer this time, as if gently restoring control over the room. "Everything in this document has been reviewed by our legal and financial teams multiple times," he said, his tone professional yet subtly dismissive. and several executives nodded again, their confidence returning in quiet waves, while one of them leaned back and folded his arms, offering a faint smile that suggested the interruption had already been resolved. Naomi Carter did not move, her hands still resting lightly on the mop handle, her posture relaxed but grounded, and she spoke once more, her voice soft yet steady. The liability shifts under conditional restructuring if market valuation drops below 70% within 12 months. The room fell silent again, not from shock, but from the unexpected specificity of her words, and a few executives exchanged quick glances, their expressions shifting from mild amusement to uncertainty. Michael Donovan paused, the faint crease forming between his brows as he glanced down at the page, though his voice remained composed. "That scenario is highly unlikely," he replied, though his eyes lingered slightly longer on the paragraph Naomi had referenced. One of the senior executives gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "We are not here to debate hypothetical risks raised by facilities staff," he murmured, his tone controlled but edged with polite dismissal, and a few others nodded, the atmosphere tilting again toward confidence. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in calm restraint, then added gently, "It transfers operational control to the partner firm under that condition." The words settled differently this time, quieter but heavier, and Richard Holloway's pen stopped moving entirely, his fingers tightening slightly around it as his eyes shifted toward the clause once more. The sunlight across the table had softened, casting a pale glow over the document, and the faint gray paragraph seemed to stand out more clearly now, though no one spoke for a few seconds. Michael Donovan leaned forward again, this time more deliberately, his finger tracing down the page, and his expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but enough for the executives closest to him to notice, their posture shifting, their earlier ease replaced by cautious attention. Richard watched without speaking, his expression calm yet focused, as Donovan scanned the clause again, then turned a page, then returned to the same paragraph, his silence stretching longer than expected. One of the executives cleared his throat quietly, the sound echoing slightly in the glass room, while another leaned forward, curiosity replacing confidence. Naomi remained still, her reflection faintly visible in the window, her breathing steady, her presence quiet yet no longer invisible. Michael Donovan finally exhaled slowly, though he did not immediately speak, and Richard lowered his pen onto the table without signing, the soft click of metal against wood echoing faintly in the stillness, as the weight of Naomi Carter's quiet words settled fully into the room. The silence in the room deepened, not tense, not hostile, but heavy with the slow shift of certainty turning into doubt, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the late afternoon light softened into a pale amber glow, reflecting across the polished marble floor where Naomi Carter stood quietly, her hands resting on the mop handle, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm as if nothing unusual had happened, yet the atmosphere around her had changed, subtle but unmistakable, like the quiet moment when a breeze moves through still air. Richard Holloway leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the document, the fountain pen now resting beside his hand, and for the first time since the meeting began he did not rush, he simply read, slowly, deliberately, his eyes tracing the paragraph line by line, while Michael Donovan remained leaned forward, his finger lightly marking the clause, his silence speaking louder than any reassurance he had offered earlier. Around the table, the executives shifted in their seats, the soft creak of leather chairs echoing faintly in the quiet room, and one of them reached for a glass of water, the faint clink against the table sounding unusually loud, while another executive leaned forward, scanning the same page now visible on the screen, the confidence that filled the room earlier fading into careful observation. Naomi remained still, her reflection faint in the glass behind her, the skyline stretching beyond, and the sunlight moved slowly across the table, illuminating the small gray paragraph more clearly as the minutes passed, while Richard's brow tightened slightly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something within the language required deeper consideration. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence, steady and low, and somewhere far below the city traffic continued its distant rhythm, barely audible from 38 floors above. while inside the room time seemed to slow, the anticipation settling into the quiet space between each breath. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly toward the marble floor, the faint reflection of her shoes visible beneath the soft glow of overhead lights. And she did not speak again. She simply waited, her calm presence unchanged, her breathing steady, her posture composed. Richard turned the page, then returned to the same clause again, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table, a small unconscious gesture that several executives noticed immediately, because Richard Holloway rarely tapped his fingers unless something unsettled his certainty. And Michael Donovan exhaled slowly, his shoulders shifting slightly as he adjusted his posture, still studying the paragraph. The room remained silent, no one laughing now, no one whispering. Only the quiet sound of paper turning and the faint reflection of sunlight drifting across polished surfaces, while Naomi Carter stood near the far wall, quiet and steady, her presence no longer invisible, as the weight of her quiet observation continued to settle into the room. Michael Donovan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the earlier confidence. If the market valuation dips below 70%, operational authority transfers to the partner firm until recovery benchmarks are met. And the words landed with a weight that spread across the table, slow and undeniable, while several executives leaned forward at once, their earlier ease replaced by sharpened attention. Richard Holloway did not move immediately, but his eyes remained fixed on the clause, reading it again, then once more, his expression tightening subtly as the implications settled in and the faint tapping of his fingers stopped entirely, replaced by stillness. One of the senior executives reached for the binder, scanning quickly, then paused, his lips parting slightly as he followed the language further down the page, and another executive pulled the document closer, adjusting his glasses, the confidence in his posture fading into careful scrutiny. The sunlight outside shifted again, the amber glow softening into early evening tones, and the reflection across the polished table dimmed slightly, while the quiet hum of the building filled the silence. Richard leaned forward slowly, his hand moving to the page, his finger tracing the paragraph Naomi had mentioned, and his jaw tightened just enough for those closest to him to notice, because the clause did not merely introduce risk, it shifted leverage entirely, granting temporary control that could become permanent under certain market conditions, and the realization unfolded not dramatically but steadily, like a slow tightening knot. Michael Donovan exhaled quietly, turning another page, then returning again, confirming the phrasing, and he glanced toward Richard, his expression now cautious rather than reassuring. One executive whispered under his breath, barely audible, "That changes everything." And another leaned back, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful silence. Naomi Carter remained near the wall, still and composed, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle, her reflection faint against the glass, and she did not look toward anyone. She simply stood quietly, as if the room had shifted on its own without her involvement. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, then looked up again at the document, his breathing steady but measured, and he slid the pen further away from the signature line, the small motion carrying more meaning than any spoken word. The room felt different now, quieter, more deliberate, and Michael Donovan spoke again, softer. "We would need to renegotiate this section," and Richard nodded slightly, not speaking yet, his attention still fixed on the clause. The skyline outside had begun to dim, city lights flickering faintly in the distance, and the polished marble floor reflected the changing light as Naomi Carter stood quietly, her calm presence unchanged, while the realization settled fully across the room, the decision no longer certain, the outcome no longer inevitable. Richard Holloway leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and for a long moment he said nothing, his eyes still resting on the document while the city outside transitioned fully into evening, the soft glow of office lights beginning to reflect against the glass walls, and the room remained quiet, not tense, but reflective, as if everyone present understood that something significant had just shifted. Michael Donovan closed the binder halfway, his posture more cautious now, and one of the executives exhaled quietly, adjusting his tie as though recalibrating expectations, while another tapped a tablet screen to flag the clause for review, the faint glow illuminating his thoughtful expression. Richard finally lifted his gaze, not toward the attorneys or executives, but toward the far wall where Naomi Carter stood, still holding the mop handle, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet and grounded as though she had simply finished her task and was waiting for the right moment to move on. Richard studied her for a brief second, his expression composed, the earlier amusement gone, replaced by a calm acknowledgment, and when he spoke his voice was measured, steady. "Miss Carter, correct?" Naomi nodded once, surprised but composed, her voice soft. "Yes, sir." The room shifted slightly, several executives turning their heads again, this time not with dismissal, but with curiosity. Richard rested his hands lightly on the table, his tone calm, but sincere. "You noticed that clause quickly," and Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, not out of discomfort, but humility. "I have seen similar structures before," she replied quietly. Michael Donovan glanced toward her, interest now replacing earlier skepticism, and one of the executives leaned forward slightly, listening more closely than before. Richard nodded once, then glanced back toward the document. "That observation prevented a rushed decision," he said, his words simple but carrying weight, and the acknowledgment settled across the room with quiet significance. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply gave a small nod, her hands still resting lightly on the mop handle, and the subtle glow of the overhead lights reflected softly across the marble floor beneath her feet. Richard then turned back toward his team, his tone returning to business. "We pause this signing until the clause is revised," and several executives nodded in agreement, their posture now aligned with caution rather than urgency. The binder was closed gently, the pen moved aside, and the room slowly shifted from anticipation to reflection, while Naomi stepped slightly to the side, resuming her quiet presence near the wall, her expression calm, her breathing steady. As though nothing extraordinary had occurred, and yet the atmosphere had changed entirely, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by quiet respect that filled the space without a single raised voice. The meeting ended quietly, without the usual rush of congratulatory handshakes or confident laughter, and one by one the executives gathered their binders and tablets, their movements slower, more thoughtful, while the skyline outside had fully transitioned into evening, thousands of small lights stretching across the city like a quiet constellation reflected against the glass walls. Naomi Carter guided her mop across the marble floor once more, the soft rhythm of her movement returning, steady and unobtrusive, as though the room had simply resumed its ordinary pace. Yet the atmosphere felt different now, calmer, grounded, shaped by a moment no one openly discussed. Richard Holloway remained seated a few seconds longer after the others began to leave, his gaze resting briefly on the closed binder, then shifting toward the reflection of the city beyond the window, his posture relaxed but thoughtful, as if replaying the quiet interruption that had altered the course of the meeting. He finally stood, adjusting his jacket, and as he stepped away from the table, his eyes moved once more toward Naomi, who continued her work with quiet focus, the overhead lights reflecting softly along the polished marble beneath her feet. Richard paused for a brief moment, not dramatic, not formal, simply a small pause, and gave a slight nod, the gesture subtle yet unmistakable, and Naomi returned the nod gently, her expression calm, her movements unhurried. The room gradually emptied, the distant sound of elevators chiming faintly in the hallway, and the hum of the building settling into the evening rhythm, while Naomi wrung the mop into the bucket, the faint sound of water echoing softly in the now quiet space. Outside, headlights traced slow lines along the streets far below, and the reflection of those lights shimmered faintly across the glass, blending with the glow from inside the room. Naomi finished the final pass across the floor, her steps measured, her posture steady, and she guided the bucket toward the door, the wheels rolling quietly across the marble, leaving behind a polished surface that reflected the empty chairs, the long conference table, and the city beyond. Richard stood near the doorway for a moment longer, glancing once more at the room, then turned and stepped into the hallway, his footsteps soft against the carpet, while behind him Naomi Carter paused briefly, looking at the skyline beyond the glass, her reflection faint against the night lights, before she turned and continued her quiet walk down the corridor, the polished floor behind her reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. and the silence that remained felt calm, steady.